All right, welcome to Artist Trauma. This week we did H.P. Lovecraft's Color Out of Space and The Rats in the Walls. So, Chris, what did you think of the readings?
Well, okay, so I thought Color Out of Space is just an objectively good story. I thought Rats on the Walls is an objectively fun story. And I had so I thought that The Rats on the Walls was more of a pop horror story, and The Color Out of a Space was more of a serious horror story. So I think they
Yeah,
contrasted pretty well.
yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good description of the two. Color Out of Space just had a lot more going for it artistically. There was a little bit of characterization. There was a more richly fulfilled world. There was a much stronger dramatic structure. Um, and
Yeah.
the rats one was like, okay, well, that's just very Lovecraft. It
It's like
interesting.
obscene Lovecraft, right? Like what I would argue though is I think that in reading these two stories, you get a very clear through line of like very specific themes that Lovecraft does in all of his stories.
Yeah,
So I think they're both archetypal of his philosophy, really. In his essay, modern supernatural the supernatural horror in literature, what he finds most horrifying is, well, I'm just going to read the sentence. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And I think that's just there, just shining through in both these stories.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's. I mean, this is what we mean when people say Lovecraftian. It's not just something that's scary.
No.
Some sense of there's some great, ancient, overwhelming, magnificent horror that if you even attempt to fathom would drive you insane. Whose ends and goals are not something that human beings can contend with.
Yeah,
Uh,
and that's very clear in The Color Out of Space, right? Because it's almost a joke to say that Lovecraft uses language like no one could know how bad it was, or the horror was beyond belief. The experience was unnameable. Like, it's what's really interesting about Lovecraft is that for so many times that he says the experience is unapproachable, what makes it horrifying is that, like, in our positioning ourselves, usually in the main character's position, following him along, we get to have the horror of not knowing at the rate in which the main character also doesn't know.
yeah,
If that makes
yeah. As in, it's usually phrased almost like a detective story, adventure story sort of pacing, where it's like, okay, like we're getting fed clues as to what's happening here.
Yeah,
About the mystery. We're figuring out along with the protagonist. Just these, yeah. Uh,
yeah,
and,
and it's
and,
for these
and on
reasons
that,
that Lovecraft is worth it in a sense, because I'm going to argue, even though I can moan and complain about the obvious faults of Lovecraft's writing, that he has so specific of a subject positioning. He's just so, you're right when you say you can say something like Lovecraftian. That is the most one of the most important positives a writer can have, in my opinion.
yeah, yeah. We'll get into the problems of execution eventually, but probably when we more dealing with the rats in the walls.
Of
Uh,
course.
but with color out of space, just
Why don't we start with Color Out of Space and do
yeah,
some?
yeah. No,
Yeah, sounds good.
that's what I want to focus.
Start with the good. Yeah.
So like I just want to say, like, in terms of this Lovecraftian, mysterious horror beyond the bounds of time or whatever, like he conveys that the subject matter of we literally have a meteor coming down, and the meteor has every kind of weird quality to it. It's like it's shrinking precipitously. It's got all sorts of weird chemical properties that cause it to be unidentifiable. It gives off a spectrum, which again is some new element which and quickly just disappears in the laboratory along with the equipment that tested it. And
Yeah,
like the
it
best thing,
self-erases itself in a great way.
yeah, and sort of the most like indicative aspect though to it is it's a color out of space. But the thing is, he says it's like, well, it's not exactly a color. It's really just a color by analogy. Like
Yeah.
and this like color by analogy, this ethereal unreality about it is that's its distinctive feature. That's how you identify something has been corrupted by this thing.
Yes. Yeah, and it's like that notion of corruption is is integral to Lovecraft. It's not just that I was picturing, by the way, when I was picturing this color, something akin to the white fog of my eye in the corner and TV static. And that's, you can picture whatever you want. It doesn't matter. You can picture nothing. But what it did do was this horrifying erasure of our picture of reality, right? Like something, a tree is stained by this color, and it implies that the tree as like an object has become fundamentally corrupted.
Yeah, yeah, it's and the corruption, I mean, I one thing I after the this meteor has come, and by the way, just so the audience knows, is the
It's a
perspective of
super
this,
simple story. Yeah, go
yeah,
for it.
like the perspective of the story is some surveyor who's gone to some town near Arkham, in New England. Um, and he's like, okay, they're going to be building a dam reservoir around here. And he's looking around and he's like, okay, there's this one part that's this what was it referred to as, the house, like the blighted spot or something like that?
The blighted heath,
The blighted
the
heath.
wicked heath or something.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
got it. The blasted heath.
The blasted heath, and
Um,
which is just this dull gray ashen thing which nothing lives around, and haunted by the superstitions and rumors and legends of the local town. um, and he talks to a local who lives fairly nearby and who was involved in the events, and basically the story is like the narrator, the surveyor, retelling um, the things that he was told about
yeah.
this, the events of this meteor coming down and what ensued afterwards. Um, so okay, so after the meteor's fallen, like one thing about it, just getting back to the corruption theme, is it's just a great way of beginning it is, it's like, oh, like there's all of the plants that are being grown on this farm are actually much bigger than normal. Like they have a surprising vitality and largeness to where extra barrels need to be ordered. But as soon as you actually like bite into them, there's this sickening, rotten flavor to them that makes them completely worthless. So it's just that bit of like, yeah, there's a certain morbid vitality, at least at this
Uh,
beginning phase. It's enticing you, but it's, oh no, oh no.
no, yeah, it's that corruption, or one might say abjection, in a sense. Actually, I would argue abjection is thoroughly in this story. In the food, you go to eat it and it's rotten. Um, in the corruption of the tree, it's not just, it starts as uncanny, but it gets so far in that it decays the people, right?
Yeah, I
And
mean it
that's pretty
starts
far
off,
along.
yeah, I mean it starts off with just little hints of like people being weaker, and there's also like, it seems like animals are acting strangely. Like you'll see a rabbit hop way farther than it should, and horses are in constant state of anxiety, and dogs disappear. And gradually, just the life around there is just, all of them are just sort of slowly decaying. I mean, in
Yeah.
really repellent fashion of just like turning, like the farms and the stock animals, they're just like turning gray and brittle.
Yeah, I
Um,
also just like I like the appearance of overabundance as actually a symptom of its decline. It's pretty, that's pretty nice.
yeah, yeah, it's
You know,
very
that's a
definite.
nice inversion, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then it gets destroyed. I mean, it's kind of like and we're back into this world. But the important thing is that the corruption is not contained, but it's by an inch. By an inch, the corruption spreads, or even a centimeter a year away from the field.
Well, I mean, where we want to next step is like, but before then is like, okay, like these two, when it really starts to eat away at the people,
Yes.
that's when things are like really getting out of control. The
And
way,
what's horrifying is that they can't bring themselves to leave. Something about the forces that be tell them they can't leave. Like they kind of are rooted. They can't escape.
yeah, yeah, as in there's this sort of more or less the dying stream of consciousness monologue that the farmer who lives, on the meteored field has. He says, like, there's something about a calling to us. There's something that makes you go on. That's very much Lovecraft. That's something that you also actually we will talk about as a aspect of or the rats in the walls.
Yeah.
Um, is that yeah, like this is the sort of thing that's reality is sickeningly horrifying, but too fascinating to look away from. Like you want to know the mystery, even if the mystery will drive you mad.
Yeah, yeah. It's the ending scene of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the man is bursting into laughter as he's also face melting off. There's a captivatingness in Lovecraft, which is really, if we can abstract a little, like an essence of horror. You don't. Why would you watch these movies if there wasn't also something deeply captivating about being held in place? Like, some of these movies you just would never watch, but there's that I have to go on
Yeah,
sense.
like
A lot of horror. Hereditary is like that for
no,
me.
I mean, like, I mean, that's sort of, yeah. I mean, that's really why does anybody watch a horror movie? Why does anybody read a horror story? Because
Right.
there's something about that horror that is intriguing for is a certain percentage of people. I myself have a more complicated relationship to horror than you do. You seem to be an unmitigated fan of it. Um,
I'm a
and
horror guy. I'm a
yeah,
horror guy in the way that my wife is a romance person, and we meet somehow and watch horror. And I don't do a lot of romance, but yeah, whatever. I'm a horror guy. I have no reservations. I can stomach the abject, and I just have fun with it.
yeah. I mean, for me, like I like horror when it's really good.
I
Um,
like it when it's really bad, which is why
um,
Lovecraft can make us both happy.
yeah, yeah, that's a good way of describing the issue. Then
Well, what I would say is, like, there's genre fiction as a whole, right? And I'm going to put romance and westerns and, like, even some crime serials and sci-fi and fantasy, all these things that are not literary fiction, have different levels of, on the one hand, prejudice against. It used to be like, oh well, that's just that thing, there's no real literary merit to whatever genre. um but I think it's also a sort of free space where you can, because the main gaze of history is not focused on you, you can do more strange stuff or get away with doing something odd or experimental, because for a long period of time history wasn't really caring about these genre fictions. It's a little weird now that we do, because then I feel like I have to turn on a more critical lens on some of this than I think it uh maybe necessitates, I guess. But that's my thought, if
yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah. I mean, I guess for me, I don't really think about that aspect of like, it's like, I don't know, the genres of like, yeah, like some genres are pulpy,
Yeah.
generally, and some genres have sort of more standard. But I don't know, there's junk in everything. Like, yeah, we say romances, but like most of great literature is in some way related to romance.
Of course.
You know, so it's like it's just, you know, in science fiction it's like, okay, sure, there's a lot of junky science fiction, but it's like then there's, you know, obvious classics that we're fine with. Horror, I don't know, I remember like for some reason I was just sort of thinking of like more interested in horror, and I was like, oh, you know, like there's a lot of good horror movies out there, and I was looking at like a shelf of DVDs, and I was like, all of this is uniform junk. Like I can pick out maybe one or two good ones out of like 50 movies. It felt like. Um,
Meanwhile, last night I watched Paranormal 6, and Anna and I were like, wow, that was way better than Paranormal 5, Paranormal Activity 5.
I don't know how you do that to
And
yourself.
I would never, I don't, well, I think that enjoyment of art and its appreciation are sometimes different than just, going skydiving.
No, no, I get it. I get
Like,
it. I
so
just
like there's nothing in, I mean like I feel like where you would, call bullshit on me is if I started trying to argue
oh no,
that
I know,
that
I
these were
know.
like great works, right?
I'm not
Their
saying
enjoyment
I'm not
depends on them not being
saying
great.
that. I'm not saying that, you know,
Yeah.
like I'm perfectly happy to play plenty of video games that have very little aesthetic merit.
And I
Uh,
think on that level is where it's perfectly acceptable to just say, like, well, as long as I know that this isn't great literature, just go enjoy. But there is also a sense in which you should at times check in with your critical eye to say, like, well, wait a minute. Are there moments in this where I thought this was going to be trash and then suddenly a light bulb kicks on and I go, oh, this is actually pretty interesting? That happens with Ari Aster's films. So, like Hereditary and Midsummer. I was like, these are real films. I just kind of had that sudden, like, oh crap, I have to be paying attention to these. What I thought were going to be fun horror flicks are now actually like very deep and introspective films. So
yeah, so but getting back to
yeah,
Lovecraft,
let's get back to Lovecraft, who
um,
who revels in both sides, I think.
yeah, just in terms of you know, like the wife goes insane and is just sort of, and well, you know, we eventually do see her, and she's, you know, the first sort of person that we see is like just this who's also like this gray disintegrating thing. And you know, like the narrator says that the farmer who telling him the story who went into the house basically euthanized her. You know, he heavily implies that. Um um
And in reading that, you're kind of like, good.
yeah.
Put
Yeah,
these people out of their misery.
yeah, like this is a creature that's not fit for life any longer. Um, I mean, it's for me. I was riveted. Like I remember when I read this years ago. I think in high school. Yeah, in high school I remember
Yeah.
reading some. I remember actually feeling fear at that time when the neighbor's farmer, comes into the house and looking around, and then there's something downstairs. There's this color out of space that is somehow rocking or moving around the space downstairs, and there's something happening. Um, I remember feeling that fear. This time I didn't. It was just sort of like, okay, like I'm riveted. My attention is there, but
I felt it around the well. That was where I thought was really well done. And the other time when I was like actually disturbed in the story was the sort of idea of implying how loud it was when they were still alive, locked in their rooms, screaming. I thought that was pretty. I was like, oh, that's pretty good. Because it had all this implied sound that was. I was like, oh, that's wild. I thought that was
yeah,
pretty.
like one boy is like just sobbing, you know, hysterically because of the death of one of the brothers. Um,
Yeah.
and the mother upstairs just screaming because she's just a lunatic. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and then things go bonkers. You know, because after this, and he's, you know, seeing all these dead people, you know, just sort of lying around. Like he goes to the police, the neighbor farmer. And they all go back down. They're all looking around, and you know, they plunge into the well, as you're saying, and like, yeah, just you could just stick a pole down that well 20 meters through the bottom and like still no sign of anything, just something squirming down there.
Love that.
Yeah,
Horrible.
yeah, and just this and just like I'd say one of the most remarkable parts of it is like throughout the story there's been these hints of like the trees move when there's no
Oh
wind.
yeah. That reminded me so much of a story that I believe was an influence on Lovecraft, which is Algernon Blackwood's The Willows,
Mhm.
which is just a great story. It's just somehow the willows become alive and not alive at the same time. And I just think I can just feel that influence and being executed really well in both stories.
Yeah. Um and for me like what just stood out to me about that about the trees what was just well the fact that yeah like somebody just sort of looks up, and this is nighttime and they just sees it's not just that they're moving without wind, it's that the branches are twitching furiously, spasmodically. It's
Yeah.
like that's a disturbing image.
Mm-hmm.
That's something fundamentally inhuman right there. That's great. It's like, and they're looking around and it's like everything's starting to have this bioluminescence, which has been again something heavily hinted at or mentioned throughout the work. It's like it's glowing. Everything's glowing with that
Yeah.
color out of space, and it's like we need to get the hell out of here. This is not where human beings should be.
So I had a question for you as I was reading this because this story felt very historical um, for a couple reasons. But here's one. I don't mean in a bad way. I just mean in a very specific way. So nowadays we have sci-fi and we have horror. And you have in the sense that sci-fi is material reality. It behaves with different advanced technology or organicism, like a species behaving in a different way. But it is sort of like you know, real. It's material. It's just materialistic stuff, but the material itself is behaving in some way we don't know yet. And then on the flip side, you have the supernatural, where it's, and I know you know this, I'm just kind of exposing this for everyone, but like the idea is on the supernatural side that you have to get onto the wavelength of the rules of the game. There's some like the ghost is a memory of a traumatic disturbance, like in The Grudge or whatever. The ghost behaves in some way, but it's not material. So the horror that we experience with the non-material is a little different, I think, has a different flavor than the horror that we experience at the material that's behaving in a different way. And why I'm placing this story historically is because there's no difference. It's just there's no difference. I don't think there's any difference between, I think it's just sort of
Well, yeah, I mean it's like
horrifying,
Alien.
right?
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, it's like Alien, and then Alien's a science fiction movie, but people comment that yeah, this is basically a haunted house movie the way it's structured.
Right. Exactly.
It's
So it's interesting when you read this because you're like, well, like someone else would show up, like a scientist, and be like, yeah, I'm not really horrified by it because this substance behaves with this in this ways with these properties and this and this. And that perspective would sort of just not make sense to Lovecraft.
well, I
you know,
mean, he actively. I mean, I won't say he exactly mocks science, but there's a way in which he belittles it. Of yeah, like there's these scientists who look around and like, okay, everything that every kind of analysis they can do is just baffled by
yeah,
this. And then later on it's like it's not even really that they're that much more interested in pursuing it later. It's just like they sort of scoff at like these rumors and from the countryside. It's and one thing that is interesting about it though is because Lovecraft makes this point multiple times, is it's not necessarily that it's a supernatural force in a certain sense. It's that it breaks the laws of nature. It's that it follows a different set of laws of nature. That it's like like it's it follows some sort of rules completely foreign from our own. And that's
Yeah.
interesting because it's like, oh yes, we live in this little corner of the universe where things have this one set of laws, but if you step outside of us, oh boy, it's a different issue.
Yeah, and I think that's where I think there's a contrasting viewpoint where look, alien films are never going to be about past trauma. Like it's a fucking alien. It's never going to be like about like this is not about someone having a deep-seated memory that's repressed or whatever. Whereas a lot in Supernatural is about like the past is a different place. I mean, fuck, this isn't a horror book, but I remember the novel The Go-Betweens has a very famous first line, and it's the past is a different country. They do things differently there. It's one of the most famous first lines of literature. But that's more on the side of what I think of the essence of supernatural horror is there's always some event in the past that makes it's a ghost was once alive, right? Whereas an alien showing up, it would be insane to look at this and be like, oh, what memory is causing the alien to show up? It would be a fundamental ridiculousness, I find. And I think that's kind of a two avenues that people take.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. Usually, there's some sort of, well, I guess part of why you want I mean, part of the why you have a past for a ghost is like, well, to give reasons for its actions.
Or
Like
to
that.
give, yeah, reasons for its lingering, even.
Yeah, I mean, there are sort of some supernatural things where it's like it's more related to, I don't know, it's like, yeah, this nature sort of fucking hates you. Like there's something like, The Shining's is sort of an example where it's just like, well, what's going on back there? Like, yeah, there's a sort of past, but God knows what it has to do with anything that's happening.
Oh,
Like
I think that's the great thing about The Shining. My theory of The Shining. I mean, there's literally a movie like 9 million readings of The Shining or whatever. Is that I think that's sort of like the theme of the movie is staring you in the face. Is like, yeah, I'm going to give you 400 rabbit holes you could go down, and they're all valid, but you can't really make any one of them the main story. It's just this just endless rabbit holes of Easter eggs and possibilities.
yeah,
But
as,
you're
as
not
in
you're not to make any one of those themes. Like, I'm going to argue that this is actually about a Native American burial ground. You're like, well, it is about a Native American burial ground, but it's also about all this other random crap. You can't just choose one reading of that.
yeah, as in and then this is like it's in a sense it's perfectly Lovecrafty in the sense of like, yeah, we've got one or two little details that sort of convey what might have been going on. We've touched um a bit of the substance of this thing, but we do not know how it functions. We do not know how to interact with this thing. This thing's laws are again beyond our comprehension.
But it knows us. What I mean by that is it has the ability to hold you in place. So in a sense, it has this really terrifying upper hand.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Of like we're just um
If it didn't have the upper
there's
hand,
no equality between us in this sense.
if it
Um
if it didn't have the upper hand, it would be like cute. Like it would be, oh, look at this color. Yeah, we had to eradicate it, but it was kind of weird, right? Okay, bye.
yeah, it would be
Not
sort
the
of,
upper hand.
I mean, it'd be sort of I remember hearing about you have John Carpenter's The Thing, and it's like they're just trying to hunt down this thing and this weird alien, ancient alien that's sort of going around the base that has this horrifying morphology.
Yeah, it's
And
awful. It's a good one.
but like
Awful.
the thing is about the thing is like, okay, you don't know where it's coming from, but they're actually giving a pretty good like attempt to destroy it. Like they're kind of on the same, they're competitive,
It's a
like they're
fight.
not, it's not like they're dealing with eldritch gods. They've actually got like a chance against it. And actually it's sort of funny of like someone apparently wrote a story about that's a different perspective on the thing, and it's called The Things, where it's the perspective of the creature talking about like, God, all these guys are just trying to rip me apart. Um, so
Oh, that's great. But you couldn't even venture. There would be no reason to do that flip of humorous inversion here because the color out of space would just be a language out of space. It would just be blah. It would
yeah,
it
yeah,
would
you can't.
you can't do
I
it. It'd
just
be
the
really
point is
stupid.
like, I mean, even like sort of like when you're dealing with the alien and alien, it's like, well, you got a chance, you got a shot here. Like, there's whole distant ancient realms sort of
Yeah.
standing behind all of this. That makes it like very Lovecraftian. Like, why does this horrifying xenomorph exist? But there's still at least a shot. With Lovecraft,
No,
there's no shot.
this is only tangentially related to horror, but I think that in this story, Color Out of Space is really it reminds me of this famous Jacques Derrida quote where he goes, "Monsters cannot be announced. One cannot say, 'Here are our monsters,' without immediately turning the monsters into pets."
Yeah.
Which I just think is a fucking great quote. Oh, excuse my friend. Sorry, I don't know if we're on YouTube, but a great quote that really does a lot of lifting with Lovecraft. Because if we gave the thing a name, come on, what are we gonna name it? Bob?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
that's
like,
like the xenomorph has been, like made jokes of and fun of like throughout because like, it's okay, we have a very specific notion of it now.
yeah, we've already turned it into a pastiche. But if you rewatch it, you're like, it actually is more horrifying because you forget the pastiche and you're just back to the thing itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing is, well, I mean, to be it turned into a Saturday morning cartoon, knowledge is power. It is like that sense of the more you know, like, does give you a sense of competency.
Mm-hmm.
And Lovecraft, he's very sensitive to that fact of well, one thing is, it isn't just you can't know about it, it's like the little bit you can know about it will undermine you. Will
It'll
under
undermine the knowledge that you thought you had about other things. It's not going to help you in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um
That's
so yeah.
that's my I think that's kind of all I would say on the story. I think there's a lot of interesting I think there's an infinite amount to talk about with the color out of space, but in terms of what I enjoyed and what I thought was really effective is the means by which he's blocking our knowledge, very effective, always in Lovecraft. The climactic horror of this story is much more successfully done. The family falling apart. So I liked that a lot. I liked the well, but more than all of that, I thought it was original.
Yeah, it was
Oh,
very original. That there's no and there's no even sense of the auto plagiarism here. It's like, this is just a nice new notion of, okay, something comes out of space, and I mean, probably people have used that premise before. Um, I mean, afterwards, but it still works with him. I'm trying to think of any other aspect. I guess one other part of it that I like is just the send off of this blighted spot, whatever it's called. This is going to be turned into a reservoir for the town, and it's the idea of like, there's a sense of, yeah, this thing is growing year by year, this sort of blighted area, and what exactly is going to happen to people when they drink this water and like slowly imbibe it, like what will develop as the years and decades roll by. There is that
wow.
sort of like horror of like, is this thing going to destroy the world? Are we all ultimately threatened? um,
Yeah, and it's kind of like the difference between that and like you know, Ice Nine by uh, Kurt Vonnegut. It's like, oh yeah, the world's destroyed. It destroyed the world. Sorry. Goodbye. We got to start with that as our starting point. Is that the horror of the implication really works? If he had continued with that, it would have been early Lovecraft. Because early Lovecraft is really a pulp writer, and I think that that pulpy sort of like, I have to give this image or else it's not real, is a mark of bad writing. Whereas now he's doing it by implication, and it's much more horrifying. There's a couple examples of which the climactic ending of the world actually works really well. There's a Black Mirror episode where it's like these little electronic bees and they're getting hacked to kill people. Do you know that one?
Yeah, no, I know that one, and I'm very
And then it kind of ends
disappointed.
with like the whoa, everyone's going, you
Well,
know?
well, I have to just say, like, and this is getting off topic. I have to say, like, about that episode, I'm very disappointed in that episode because they wuss out, in my view, of what they should have. As in, the whole idea is like, oh, everybody votes, and then on who they want dead, and then the person who gets the most votes dies because of these, mechanical bees that are around, and the idea is like what the show should have done is like, yeah, and what happens to society when you live in that situation? Nobody uses their name in public, basically. Um, yeah, like when you post research, you do not have your name attached to it. Politicians have to be anonymous, or so on and so forth. Like
Oh,
that's a
that's
so much more
great.
interesting and horrifying world that they could have done. They just, like, oh, okay, and then they kill a whole bunch of people, whatever.
And I agree, actually. And actually, that's, I know we're going to get back to, because I think we're ready to move to the other story. But the last thing I'll say about Black Mirror is I think they consistently um, do that, right? Like that's my critique of the
Well,
show is
like
they have some great episodes, but they don't always follow through.
yeah, like,
Always.
it's a very inconsistent show.
Yeah.
They have some really great episodes. They have some bad episodes, and they have some mixed ones.
Yep.
Um, and it's impressive, the variety. But so is the Twilight Zone. So
And so is Lovecraft. So, okay, are you ready to move to the Rats in the Walls, or is there
yeah,
anything you would to
yeah,
say?
I'm ready. I'm ready, and we'll be talking about color out of space as contrast, and also just as an aspect to it too. But yeah, so let's get into Rats in the Wall. So what do you want to say about it, Chris?
Okay, so this is harder to talk about for me because I think it's not as good. But I still quite enjoyed it. I had fun reading every page. I also thought there was a lot of sentences in this that are archetypal of Lovecraft in the same way that are very successful. I want to start with the stuff I don't think is as successful really quick. I think that the metaform that he has of the whole mythosphere and everything sometimes names the monster and turns them into pets. So like when he references Nyarlathotep or whatever, it doesn't do it for me. And I think part of it is because he's kind of been turned into a monster in the canon, and he's kind of just like not horrifying. He's now a pet or an image, but he's it's kind of lazy, to invent somewhere in plot B a monster and then use that monster's horrifying qualities from a different story to service this story's horror. It seems
Yeah,
uh
that
you
might
know
be like, and well, for me, like, I didn't know, I haven't read enough of his stories to recognize it. Like, I know about Cthulhu, but that's kind of, I don't know about how his whole mythology fits together. Um, um, I mean, for me, like, my problems with Lovecraft are things really just on the level of not enough character and not enough style. The style, like, I think he's good at, like, certain details. but a lot of the time he falls too much into, mystical depths and unnameable horror and eldritch nightmares and all of this other stuff. It's like, no, I please give me like more actual details here. Like, tell me exactly what the room was like. Tell me exactly what the creaks sounded like. Tell me exactly what this person looked like when they turned their face. Like, these are the sorts of details that I really, really want, and that you're not giving me. And sometimes I feel like I'm moving among abstractions and
Yes.
not in a world. And
Yeah.
that's it's more offensive in some stories than in other that quality. I think Color Out of Space was passable, perfectly passable in terms of the level of
Right.
detail. And then again, I note a lot of good details. Like, it's very imaginative.
Yeah.
This one was a lot more of a failure in my mind, because it again relied a lot less on good details. It still was fun. I agree with you. It still was, like, riveting. Like, okay, like, what the hell's going on here? What's up with the
Yeah.
rats? Um,
I also just love the idea of the end of him. It's so this is also isn't this just camp? This is camp, right? Like the ending of the story is great, but it's only great if it's camp. He falls
no, I
into the
don't.
distant languages and it's so cheesy, and yet it kind of works structurally, right? Like he falls. So the ending, by the way, the story, God, it's such a mess. I mean, so it's a guy who gets a castle and it's relatives have owned it and going back centuries, and uh there's sort of wow, there's so much going on in the story. How would you give a really can you
Well,
give a really quick
yeah.
summary of
It's
the story?
basically like, basically, there is this ruin of a castle in England that was, the family was all slaughtered by one of the members of it back in like the 1600s or something. A distant progenitor of that supposed murderer has made of great wealth and is now in the 1920s restoring the castle and is going back to live in it. And when he's there, you just constantly hear these rats, like, just moving around the walls, and the cats are bothered by them too. Um, they find there's some sort of mysterious depths, and you learn about, all the sort of lore. Like, that's one thing that Lovecraft likes a lot, is lore. Um,
And again,
there's
this is on the side of camp, lore, characters in
well,
a meta universe,
I mean,
like
okay, I know. Okay, when you say camp, what do you mean?
Friday the 13th, the Munsters, camp,
Like,
fun.
I think, like, today, we think of Frankenstein. Like, what do you mean that's scary? Like, that's just the most. I mean, the most moving scene of Frankenstein are the sad ones for us now. Like,
Yeah.
like, that's it's not a horror movie, but like, this stuff is like, yeah, you can say, like, yeah, it's very much a parody of Lovecraft, how Lovecraftian it is, and how, like, no in the worst sense of that word, of like,
Yeah.
just
So
rerunning.
USA Today gives us their definition of camp. I don't know why USA Today had this article, but okay. Um, Over the top, eccentric, ridiculous, unexpected, out of the ordinary, striking, and I would also add not great. or
Yeah.
and that's and all of that fits this story. Over the top. I mean, the last page is him sliding in out of the contemporary English into distant languages, back into frickin' Latin, and then just like like it's then just like gurgling sounds of the before humans. Agus litza, ungo, ungo, arga, chuka, chuka, chuka. I mean, it's just cheesy as hell, but you know, there it is.
I mean, I'm kind of, I'm way more sympathetic with Lovecraft, of like,
Uh,
of just this idea of some sort of deep genetic memory or something. And because, like, that's what sort of the interesting twist is. Like, well, there weren't really any rats in a sense, or at least ultimately, like, it's not even that there aren't any rats, it's moreover this the issue of the rats were somehow deep inside of him. like he is the progenitor of this family that committed horrible rituals for millennia. And he's, as they go down to this deep subterranean depth, um he's himself thrown back into that and like cannibalizes one of the other men
Yeah,
going down with him. And it's like, okay, like that's, I mean, one problem with that is like, well, I none of these characters are characters to me, so I don't care. It's like, oh, okay, well, that happens. Um, but
that's also a marker of camp. Like, you know, in Friday the 13th, you don't really care who the teenagers are. They're just there to die in a creative way.
okay, actually I want to like take a little aside here into this whole concept of camp that we're using here.
Have you not heard? Is that a new term
No,
for
no,
you?
I've heard it. I've heard it a lot of times, and I do think it's identifying as something legitimate. But like, I just want, to be like, like you were giving things like over the top and exaggerated and things like that. Like, well, like there's a lot of great literature that is over the top and exaggerated, but but like that's great. Like it earned it. Like let's see, what is a good example? It's like something like, I don't know, The Exorcist. To keep it within horror, like the
Yeah.
things that the girl does at the end, like, yeah, vomiting everywhere, your mother sucks cocks in hell, like, like this is
Yeah.
over the top. This is over the
The
top.
in The Shining, the guy giving a blowjob in a bear costume, which is deeply strange and actually kind of takes me out of the film. But still, there it is. It's over the
No,
top.
well, that works. That works for me because it's just like reality is broken, guys.
Ah.
Um, like, like we need a factory reset on this thing. Like that's kind of the way I'm reading it.
Okay, so I think I can be more specific. So camp is, first of all, there's culturally ordained zones where camp happens. The Room is in a sense camp. Everyone goes to the theater and enjoys it, but it would be wrong to say the aesthetic merits of a thing. What you're doing is you're enjoying, I would argue, its faults, and you're enjoying them with full knowledge that these faults are faults. It's not like people are enjoying camp and saying, no, 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 this is great. I think that camp has, so I would say B horror movies is the ultimate camp.
Yeah. Okay. So what it feels like to me, it's like it's this intensely exaggerated form that's cheap, that's shoddy. It's like a shoddy exaggeration.
You can almost think of Restoration era Shakespeare as camp, but that's not related.
No, no. I mean, actually, I don't think in a big way. I wouldn't say that that's too far off. You could almost like when I think about certain Rococo paintings. There's some Rococo paintings that like work and are somewhat tasteful, and then there are other ones that are like really just hitting that Rococo hard.
Yeah, like the Rocky Horror Picture Show is just camp. I mean, you can go and dance. You know, what good movie are you going to be dancing to? um, I think that's pinning it down a little bit more. You have a slight inversion on aesthetic tastes instead of like
Yeah, as
structure and that. And so why I'm calling this camp is because if I don't, I think it's really bad. Like but I'm still enjoying it. And so if I'm saying, oh well, critically I find this not a very good story, and yet personally I'm really enjoying it,
okay.
it's
So
lining
that's
up
the
with
quality. That's the quality. Basically, good bad.
I
Like
think it's
that's
good bad. I
yeah.
think it's good bad. I think this story is good bad. And
I
I think
would,
Color Out of Space is just good.
yeah, I would agree. Well, I do not. I can have a. I enjoy good bad things to a degree. Like like The Room. Like there's just magnificent moments in that thing.
Of course.
Just moments of editing and ADR that transcend aesthetic qualities.
Oh.
Um,
Are you
but
thinking where this is like just instead of good bad or bad good, mid mid?
yeah, this is sort of to me like, okay, like this is the Lovecraft you get when you ask Chat GPT for some Lovecraft. You know, uh, it's like, yeah, it fits all the standard things, and it's a little bit original, but it was, there just wasn't a whole lot there for me. Like,
So
I
there's a
guess,
couple things I like though. Can I give you a
yeah,
part I like?
no, I don't want to throw this story under the bus exactly. Like I think there, like it was interesting. It was riveting.
Um, oh my gosh, where is it? So there's a really nice spot, which is kind of hard to picture, where they're talking about inscriptions. Ah, here it is. We did not pause long, but shivering began to clear a passage down the steps. It was then that Sir William, examining the hewn walls, made the odd observation that the passage, according to the direction of the strokes, must have been chiseled from beneath. And okay, there's problems with that because I have trouble picturing what the hell he's even talking about. Like I was trying to do the physics in my mind, but I liked it in the sense of like there's something even deeper at work affecting reality from below.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Like,
I thought it was effective, even if it was hard to picture,
oh no,
actually.
I think that's a great thing to point out. Just like this idea of it's a it's an inversion of like, no, it's not that there's some like human beings from above built this. It's like, no, something dark and evil from below built this. That's great.
Yeah, and it's actually something where if there was a film of this, which would totally be a B horror movie, in my opinion, I feel like, or it would be like National Treasure. I think it'd have to be like you'd have to really think about how you want what it would actually mean mechanics wise to portray something from being made from beneath.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that feels to me like a great idea, actually, like to do that. Like I do feel there's like a good that's a good moment in a Lovecraft inspired movie. Um
What I don't, I mean, again, every positive about this story I can also give a critique of. Where I can't do that in the Color Out of Space, I just like leaving it alone, and it's good. In this one, I just wish he had focused a little more. I mean, I think a lot of the problems in this story, I'm like, focus, tell me more. That's a horrifying image. Can you tell me a little bit? Can you make me
yeah.
more mystified by it?
Yeah,
Right?
like I mean this is actually this goes back to my criticism of like not enough details, not enough rich detail. And well actually
Yeah,
here like characterization is actually something that we desperately needed in this story.
need it, but we only need it from the main character. We just need him a
Yeah,
little
yeah,
more.
we need him to be more than just like, oh, I'm just sort of a bored rich man who just sort of wants to restore this castle of my ancestors.
Because then
You
you're like, okay, then go die. I don't care.
it's
Like, who
like
cares
no,
about
like
you?
we would like it if there were just things in his life that were, like he has certain values that we identify with. Like, I don't know, like he's always been interested in ancient scholarship and he talks about that, and he has a girlfriend, and there's sometimes he has these surreptitious fiendish impulses with her, and there's something that he doesn't understand about those impulses, and we finally see like that sort of blowing up fantastically with the final sequence or something, and like he ends up
Right,
killing her, like that would be like, oh, okay, character, we care about this.
right. So there are. I read a lot of Lovecraft now. I mean, I'm like about 20 of his stories or so, 15 to 20. So I've kind of gotten like a picture of his body of work. Okay,
Yeah.
and I think there's an interesting thing that he finds horrifying that I don't know if we find as horrifying as he does.
Black
So,
people.
well, yeah. Okay. Wait, we gotta talk about it. I'm sorry, we have to mention it. It ruined. So, oh, it's okay. So there is a cat in this story who's, or not a cat. Yeah, it's a cat whose literal name is N-word man. But and
Yeah,
in
yeah. Well, we can leave it alone. We can call him this
but like,
Nigel man.
and
Um,
then you're like, oh, that's really weird. I wonder if it's because. And then it's like it's because he had a cat in real life named that.
Yeah, it's.
But I was like, oh God, Lovecraft.
I mean,
Okay,
it fits in the
it
sense
fits.
of, like when you are like a vicious, like when you are a racist, and like particularly when you're an anti-Semite.
Hmm.
I mean, really, like historical anti-Semitism is very Lovecraftian in a huge way. Of like, you
Yeah.
believe in blood libel. You think that Jewish babies are born blind and need the blood of Christians in or spread over their eyes so that they can see. You believe in all these
Yeah.
horrifying rituals that are
Also, that like
done.
the other races can make your culture impure,
Yeah,
right?
like,
And so, like,
they're corrupting. They're
yeah. Would you say that? Okay, I had this thought, like, it's a thought of a couple philosophers where, like, there's different types of prejudice, right? There's sexism or anti-LGBT or racism or whatever. But for Lovecraft, would you say that all prejudice is anti-Semitism? Just in different forms. Like, it doesn't matter if the person's black or Indian or whatever, or African, or I mean, he hates
no,
everybody.
I
This
mean,
he like equally hates all the others, right?
I'm not. I mean, I don't know. I haven't read enough
I mean,
Lovecraft.
even rural New Englanders, like even people from his own countryside, it's like, oh, you really just like your own social milieu of your own part of the world is what he likes, which
Yeah,
is
no,
the mark of someone really stupid to me. I mean, just saying, it is kind of tricky sometimes with Lovecraft.
yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about his biography. I don't know enough about all his specific hates. I mean, I do think racism comes in different flavors. Like there's a fundamental identity of people's moral worth is determined by their biology. That's sort of the common unity between them, but like the motives for which people were racist against blacks in the South, historically, is like that's different in my mind than the reasons against the Jews. Um, like against black is more like, well, we just want this inferior group to do work for us. Against the Jews, it's more like there's something, and it's almost like you envy them because like, oh yeah, like they make money supposedly, and they're the money lenders, and we hate those things. And there's something deeply conspiracy, like there's no black people are secretly running the world conspiracies, at least as far as I'm aware. But like anti-Semitism, that's what anti-Semitism looks like. It's the
Yeah.
Rothschilds
Yeah,
conspiracy.
it's this I think that's a great argument for it being slightly different. So in Lovecraft, having read a bunch of his stories, I would say that you're totally right, actually. There's the corrupting racial factor, which can happen in a lot of his stories. There's a story, and I just find this story really dumb, but like everyone in this lineage of this family eventually goes insane. And it turns out that a large core component of it is because they descended from an ape king, which is fine, except for we all sort of descended from an ape king. Like, it's a story of African tribes and everything, but really, what's a big part of the horror is the fact that they're not like white. It's just in there. They're kind of corrupted, right? That's so
Yeah,
that's one type of horror. The other side is like in the Call of Cthulhu, which is pretty light on the racism. It's not really like, for him, it's
yeah, like
really
there's
it's like
touches.
the humanist,
There's
Lovecraft.
hints like a
Yeah,
nautical looking Negro.
yeah.
Um,
Well,
that's
and
the
then
way.
but
I'm,
it's like
I'm just quoting him when I say that.
yeah, yeah. Of course, don't worry. I'm not like Ray. Why would you say that? But no, in that story, there's a different type of racism, which is like only the tribal primitive can unleash Cthulhu in a sense. For some of those, like the ceremonial aspect of it, which was pretty effective actually. And that's a different thing than the corrupting factor, I think.
Yeah, yeah, it is a different thing. I've actually never really thought about this issue until now. Just like the varieties of racism. Um, just like the different kinds of roles it serves.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I it's interesting in that way. This,
And I think it's important to like mention because I think this is the first writer we've read where we're both, it's just like, oh my God. You
Yeah,
know, there's a historically centered aspect of different writers and their racism, which is fine to overcome, and you kind of bypass it or acknowledge it and move forward, and it's not core to their writing. Lovecraft, having read these stories and also some of his journal entries, he's the only writer I think we've read where racism is a he marks it as a part of his core identity.
yeah,
He's always talking about it. It's not.
yeah.
It's
It
very
is
important.
it is a central part of his life. Like as a
Yeah.
contrast, we did Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and that book. I mean, you could read like some of the ways the natives are described as being like okay, maybe as racist, but it seems more just like no, like he genuinely sympathizes with their plight, and they look inhuman because they're treated in this horribly inhuman way, and if they're primitive, it's well, British we're just as primitive when the Romans
Yeah.
colonized Britain.
But already you're thinking. I mean, there's no reason, like Lovecraft's racism, there's almost no reason to even think about it. It's just there. Like with
Yeah,
Conrad, it's just a more interesting, nuanced conversation. It's not
yeah.
even something
I
where
mean, like one. I guess one big part of it is maybe this is another difference is you know Conrad is a better writer, which is to say he's better at thinking about human beings and their experiences. While what's his Lovecraft, he's not as good of a writer. He's not as interested in human beings. He's not as interested in what they actually like. So that makes him able to be, you know, have a lot worse ideas. Um, I mean, there are some really repellent writers who apparently are good, like John Janae. He was a
Celine,
yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
Celine was a so anti-Semitic. Um,
so like, it'll be interesting to see what. I mean, I have I hate John Janae, but I have a somewhat high opinion of him as a writer. Um, we'll see what Celine is like when we get around to him one day, possibly. Um,
I don't know. The whole second half of this book I finished by Kristeva on Objection was about Celine, and the passages she chose fit it really perfectly. And yet I was like, I don't know if I want to read it.
I mean,
So
there's a good like there's actually a pretty good Sartre story about I think it's like the birth of a leader or the childhood of a leader and how he basically this young man turns into a leader of anti-Semites.
mm,
Um and it's interesting like the genesis. I don't really know. I feel like dealing with Sartre because Sartre is he's a great writer and vaguely repellent. um
and for those listening, Ray and I have long talked about our really complicated relationship with Sartre. I think I have a
yeah,
very I do not my it is very very ambivalent
I mean,
and
I'm gonna say just in Sartre's benefit,
yeah,
I like reading him, which is
yeah.
something that there are many authors I respect. There's a lot fewer that I enjoy, and I enjoy Sartre. Um, so anyway,
Cool.
getting
So
back to
getting
Lovecraft.
back to Lovecraft, well, I think we've really spelled out our issues and successes of this story. I think there are, I would say, two Lovecrafts then. Like there's a lot of people go through four or five different changes. I think Lovecraft has really two types of writing. Um, and it's the early stuff versus the more mature stuff. I just think he just kind of falls clearly into this where the early stuff is like sensationalized. And when I say sensationalized, I mean a sort of emotional tenure that hasn't been earned by the writing.
Mhm.
And then a more mature sense, again, not knowing exactly where these years are, but just knowing a story is mature or not, where in the mature writing, Color Out of Space, Call of Cthulhu, um, maybe at the Mountains of Madness in a certain degree, maybe that's borderline. There's a sense that the pacing is correct. He's become a better reader of himself critically. Um, I always remember reading a letter that he sent where he was making fun of some of his earlier stories, and that's a good thing. As you would, it's good, like, because it shows that he can see that this is overly purple. So I enjoyed the Rats in the Walls, but I didn't enjoy it for its positive qualities. I enjoyed it for its faults.
Yeah, Rats in the Walls was to me like that was fun. I'm not belittling it. It's just like, yeah, just it's just not that great. Wouldn't recommend it, but I do recommend Call Out of Space if you like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
So to like kind of finish up with Lovecraft, the reason why I wanted to read him is because I've been reading a lot of horror, and I did, I'm reading like Freud's Uncanny and Abjection and all this stuff that's about horror. And so when we were doing this, I also read his essay on horror because, all these people have contrasting views of what horror is. But also, I think he's the type of writer, and I think there's a lot of these that we're going to have where they're not great, but they still have something to say that's vital. And so they're kind of like a thorn in one side. And Lovecraft is that type of writer to me. He's kind of just putting his thorn in my side, even if he's nowhere in the same league as James Joyce or Chekhov.
yeah, yeah, I think that's like Lovecraft's greatest achievement is his vision. It is that vision of mysterious, great, overwhelming horrors, and it's been an inspiration to many, many other writers and artists. Of like, just a couple examples is Alien. Just it's like yeah, it's like it is Lovecraftian, and it pays off in a much more significant and fully realized way. Same thing with the Shining. I think there has to have been something there that's connected with that, like that notion of horror influenced Kubrick. I actually a movie that I have a very hard time believing that it wasn't influenced by Color Out of Space in some capacity. Is an Annihilation. That's a much more recent film, but it's like there's literally a meteor that comes down to space, this growing sort of perimeter of corruption around it, and they go in and they explore it, and there's this wonderful mixture of this place is completely screwed up and disgusting and horrifying and twistedly beautiful and magnificent.
Oh, I've
Um,
heard. I haven't seen this movie, but I've been recommended to me. This movie's been recommended to me by like everyone I know. So
yeah,
I would watch it.
it's a very solid movie, Annihilation, and there are one or two horror scenes and disturbing and some solidly disturbing imagery in there, but I wouldn't call it a horror movie fundamentally.
Yeah, it's
Um,
kind of like Jeff Vandermeer's Zone. What is it? It's like the zone where bodies move and change, and it also is a retelling of if I remember right, it has elements of Tarkovsky's Stalker, where there's a zone where matter behaves differently, and the stalker is the guide that goes in.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. So like, I just think actually Annihilation is an interesting one to
yeah,
because it is
another
it,
one.
it is actually very, and I have to say just the visuals of it does feel like, oh yes, that is a color out of space,
Mm,
like it actually captures that exact quality. Like
yeah,
actually a part of me couldn't help but read this story without that lens of of that film. um
excited to see it now. One last quick discussion before we finish up, because I think we covered everything I wanted to say on Lovecraft
we
almost.
did we got through it all and more.
But one thing I wanted to ask is, do you feel that Invasion of the Body Snatchers is Lovecraftian, or is that different?
Well, it depends on which invasion you're talking about. Uh, yeah. Of course, we're talking about the Robert Redford.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the
like,
original is also very good too. It's but yeah.
yeah. I mean, like the Robert Redford. I mean, that's um. Let's see. Yeah, like there's some sense of mysterious force, some mysterious presence that's like infecting all the world around you. But I think the big difference is that movie is dominated by paranoia. Um, it's dominated by the feeling of there's something horrifying that's infecting everyone around me. Um,
Yeah.
while Lovecraft is more like, no, there is this patina of regular life and normal existence, but you scratch that patina and there are mysteries beyond saying. One thing is Lovecraft characters, maybe they might feel threatened by
Mhm.
some shadowy organization occasionally. Like that's how Cthulhu works.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a town like Shadow over Innsmouth where like yeah, there's something mysterious here. There's something wrong about these people.
Mm.
But in general, paranoia isn't something that gets into his world.
No, he's like a thinker or a writer of territory. Like one of the most important things in all Lovecraft stories is geography, terrain. I mean, all the editions you have some landscape. You know, it's dreamscapes. It's you can't say Lovecraft without talking about territory, really. I mean, it's or geography, I guess. More, you know, you have to go to the basement of the world. You have to go to the kingdom at the end of night. You got to,
Yeah,
you know,
you,
there's
you
places.
gotta go to the somewhere in the South Pacific.
Yeah,
Um,
there's somewhere in the South Pacific with the fish monster, which was really cheesy, but still, you know, works.
I'm okay with that.
Like the one, okay, yeah, but like, and that's also one. Actually, okay, that's the last thing I'll say on him. That's another thing I like is he's a writer of territory, of fantastic geographies, of pillars that angle and whatever.
Yeah,
You know,
I would just say that I guess Invasion of the Body Snatchers is too human.
yeah,
Um, it's like no people are maybe there'll be some screwed up people and to use his phrasing, degenerate races who might do
yeah,
this sort of thing. But no, like Cthulhu's above using people. You know, yeah. So yeah,
yeah,
um, yeah. So I guess that's the major way that I'm. The big takeaway for me of Lovecraft, the way it's traumatized me, is just that vision of some great dark force beyond our understanding, um, which I find a little hard to relate to. I don't feel that way about the world. I don't have a mystical attitude.
well,
Um,
but so that relates to mine. So like when I was a kid, I was never raised Christian or whatever, and but people would ask like, oh, well then do you not have a sense of an afterlife? And now I would just say, well, no. But like then it was like, well, and I really believed this as a kid. Like, you know, I think of all the reality that we know as like us standing on the edge of a little shelf. And when we die, we get to see just a little bit about how vast reality is beyond that. And I don't believe that anymore, but I like it. I liked my former self's
well,
reasoning,
actually,
you know?
I'm gonna say this. Like when I was a kid, I have no
Yeah.
idea what the movie was, and I think I was probably like the movie was more intelligible than this. It just I was too young to understand what was happening. But it's some kid is like in this big, this big dark cavern in space, and there's some huge creatures that sort of move along in this lumbering shadowy fashion, and there's strange lights and conduits along the walls, and it's genuinely just like how is he going to get out of there, like. And I remember having this deep gut feeling of fear at that image, and I can still picture that very intensely to myself of the only way you could survive in such a universe is by sheer chance. And that has all of the Lovecraftian features to it of great unintelligible forces that'll crush you without even knowing it. Like that's and I had that vision as a kid. It was not a
Mm.
influential vision, I don't think, but because I just didn't fear was not a predominant emotion in my childhood. But like I it's a big important kind of feeling. And I'm
Right.
glad that Lovecraft can help me to sort of like explore that realm.
Yeah. Well, great.
Yeah.
Thank you for reading Lovecraft. We are going to continue with more, sorry, Lovecraft, real literature next week. He's real literature. He's just, he's like, we'll allow you on the council, but you don't have the rank of master.
Yeah, well, it's
It's like,
yeah, fine. You're doing a stinking prequels reference. Now you're really
of
lowering it.
course, yeah.
That's
That's
insulting.
literally how I feel about him. It's like, we're gonna put you on the council, but you do not get the rank of
Oh
master.
Christ. You're only 17. Whatever it was in the movie. In that movie. Um,
Right.
yeah. So anyway, yeah, we'll get back to like Eugene O'Neill or whatever next week.
Very excited to read it.
Yeah. So all right. Well, I'm glad that you got me to revisit Lovecraft. It's
Now we're done with Lovecraft. I'm done
yeah,
forever with
yeah. Me
Lovecraft.
too. Me too.
I'm
I
good.
we
I've
need
got
something to
nothing
clear
to
the
say.
air.
I've got like nothing to say on him anymore. We cleared the air on everything I have to say about Lovecraft, and so now I don't have anything else left. I need to deal with that man.
All right, great, Chris. All right, see you later. Bye,
Sounds
everybody.
good. Bye bye.